Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming today to the Carnegie Endowment to hear presentation of the Asian Development Outlook. We are very pleased to host today Chang-Hyung Lee, who is the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and the chief spokesperson for the bank on economic and development trends, and who also manages the research department at the Asian Development Bank. Dr. Lee was previously a relatively recent addition to the Asian Development Bank. He previously was the Secretary General and Sherpa for the 2010 G20 summit, which was held in his country, South Korea. So he was basically the chief organizer of the G20 summit in Seoul 2 years ago. And before that, he was the vice chairman of the Financial Services Commission and the chairman of the Securities and Futures Commission of Korea. So he has a very broad background, both as an economist and in financial markets. We are delighted to have him with us. And to my left, as discussant of the Asian Development Outlook 2013 presentation by Dr. Lee, is my former colleague and old friend, young friend, Andrew Burns, who is manager of the Global Economic Trends at the World Bank, and he is responsible for putting together essentially the forecast and ongoing analysis of global economic trends for the World Bank. So I'm sure Andrew will have a few things to say about the report and the Asian Development Outlook more generally. Today or yesterday, the IMF published its own World Economic Outlook, which disappointed some because growth was somewhat less rapid projected for 2013 in the world than they had done 6 months ago. But is it really that bad? And Dr. Lee is going to enlighten us on the fastest growing region of the world. He's also going to say a few words about energy, the energy outlook in Asia, which of course is of fundamental importance for Asia and for the rest of the world. So, Dr. Lee, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dadush. And it's my great honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for Carnegie to host this Asian Development Outlook launch here in Carnegie Center. Let me see. It's not moving, so I think I have to do it manually. So I have 20 minutes, right?
25.
Okay. So let me start with our key findings. As Dr. Dadush mentioned, at this moment, looks like everybody is expecting good news only from Asia, but that is quite burdensome for us. But actually, we have a little bit good news this year. Last year, together with advanced economies, Asia's two giants, China and India, was slowed down quite significantly. But this year, we are looking at developing Asia's growth rate will pick up from 6.1% in 2012 to 6.6% in 2013 and 6.7% in 2014. So recovery is coming. And this recovery is led by China's rebound and also continued surprisingly remarkable resilience in ASEAN countries. And these China and ASEAN economies are driving developing Asia's pickup. Inflation is still lower than around 4%, so remain in check. But I think in the future, the inflation pressures are building in the midst of the continued loose monetary policy of the advanced economies. So we are saying that last year, because of slowdown of the region, we didn't emphasize the inflation pressure, but looks like from now on, as most of Asian economies are operating near production potentials, and given the continued loose monetary policy of the advanced economies, we are emphasizing that some countries in Asia probably has to start looking at the inflation pressure. At this moment, downside risk is also remains, but tail events seems to be much subdued. On the other hand, risk in this point seems to be a little bit more political by nature. For example, the political difficulties in handling debt ceiling in the United States, and also austerity fatigue, which may derail the reform effort in peripheral European countries, and also the border dispute in Asia seems to be a kind of political risk that we have to look at. And then we are saying that if Asia start to recover and maintain above 6% growth rate in the next decade, it has a very important implication for the energy demand in Asia. And we want to discuss what implication it has for the global as well as Asian economies in the future. So I will show you some key statistics. As I mentioned, the growth rate in Asia will pick up from 6.1% of last year's slowdown to 6.6 and 6.7%. On the other hand, we, as you mentioned, that still we also believe, like IMF, the slow growth of advanced economies will continue in 2013 and 2014. U.S. seems to be a little bit better shape, so we're expecting U.S. growth rate will be 2% this year. On the other hand, Eurozone area's growth rate will be minus 0.3% this year. Japan last year has a 2% growth rate because they are recovering from the Fukushima nuclear accident. But this year, we're expecting they will grow 1.2%, but this 1.2% didn't reflect the recent announcement of Central Bank of Japan's very aggressive monetary policy. So probably in next month, we have to revise upward a little bit of this Japanese growth rate because it's not reflecting fully the Abenomics. But without incorporating the new expansion monetary policy, we're expecting Japan will grow 1.2% at this moment. When you look at this chart, actually shows the contribution of each component of growth in 2012. At the bottom, the sky blue bar denotes the contribution from the export, net export. As you can see, contribution of the net export to the Asian growth last year was most negative. It's reasonable because, advanced economies are slowing down, export drops, and Asia is doing relatively better, so import remains. So net export was actually contributing negatively to the Asia's growth in 2012. On the other hand, the good news is that consumption is actually driving the Asian growth at this moment. The contribution of consumption is denoted by the red bar in the middle. And then the violet color in the top means the contribution by the investment. And you can see, depending on the countries, contribution by investment varies a lot. So overall, I think the Asian growth in 2012 was led by domestic expenditure, such as consumption and investment. That's a good sign, which means that the rebalancing is well on the way. And the current account surplus of developing Asia countries was 5.4%, for example, in 2008. Now it's going down to less than 2%, and we are forecasting that current account surplus of developing Asia will go down further to 1.9% and 1.8%. Okay? And the region's recovery is well shared by many sub-regions, but it's led by China. And we are forecasting Chinese growth rate, which was 7.8%, which was the lowest in the last 5 years, but will recover to 8.2% and 8.0%. So timing is not good, and last week we have a news that the Chinese growth rate was a little bit slower than we expected, but we are, in some sense, we are still confident that China will grow more than 8% this year. India's growth rate, we are forecasting that they will grow from 5.0% in last year to 6.0 and 6.5%, under the assumption that the current reform effort of India will continue. And our growth forecast for India is slightly higher than the growth forecast of the IMF, and we have more confidence that Indian government will continue its reform. So under that assumption, India growth rate will be 6%. Most important fact at this moment is that if you look at the India's growth rate 6%, China's growth rate around 8%, that is very high growth rate by its standard. But on the other hand, lower than their growth rate in 5 years ago. In China has 9% growth, India has 8% growth rate, but it's slightly lower. But still, developing Asia's average growth rate maintained well above 6%. Because some other regions are emerging as a dynamic center. That is an example of ASEAN economies, such as Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Myanmar is coming up. So these ASEAN economies showing quite resilient performance. Last year's ASEAN's growth rate is 5.5%, and we are expecting that they will maintain 5.4% and 5.7% growth rate and in the near future. And you may say, 5.4 is less than 5.5. But last year's 5.5% growth rate was much due to the strong rebound from Thailand, from 0% growth rate due to the flood to 6% growth rate of last year. But if you just exclude that, typical cases, then I think the storyline is that ASEAN economies are maintaining mid 5% growth rate, and we have a high expectation on their robust performance in the future. After 2015, they will have a further regional integration we call ASEAN Economic Community, and this further regional integration will make them to continue to have a quite resilient economic performance. So ASEAN is actually coming as a new center of dynamism in Asia. Let's move on to the capital flow and the inflation part. And this relatively strong fundamentals and also loose monetary policy of the advanced economies helped the capital flow to come back to Asia after the global financial crisis. So this chart shows that on the, let's say, on this, in your right side, I think, in your right side graph, this shows that the capital inflow to Asia in terms of GDP. And prior to the crisis, in Asia, let's look at the blue bar, and without excluding Hong Kong and Singapore, because Hong Kong and Singapore, in terms of GDP, the capital inflows are quite enormous numbers. So I do not want to distort the numbers. Excluding them, the Asia's capital inflow over GDP ratio prior to crisis is about 9.4%. It really plummeted to the 1.7% immediately after the global financial crisis, but it sharply rebounded to the pre-crisis level from 2010. Okay? And then slowed down slightly after the European crisis became more severe. So in some sense, capital inflow plummeted after the global financial crisis, but rebound quite quickly back to Asia. And we believe that is much due to the quantitative easing of U.S. Because considering the heightened uncertainties and credit constraint, advanced bank, if U.S. didn't do the QE, probably the capital inflow to the region has to remain quite low. But it rebound very quickly means that QE contribute to sharp recovery of the financial inflows to the region. And then our statistical analysis shows that this increased capital inflows and the QE has affected the currency appreciation in Asia, and also real estate prices increase, and also somehow financial stability of the region, because it make the capital coming back to Asia. But interesting fact is that depending on the exchange rate regime, the effect seems to be quite heterogeneous. Economies such as economies which has a more developed financial market and more open capital market in Asia, such as Japan is a good example. Hong Kong economy is another good example, and Singapore is another good example. Those countries with those economies with more open financial market had more capital inflows coming in, and countries with maintained more flexible exchange regime like Japan and Singapore, they showed more currency appreciation like Korea. On the other hand, economies like Hong Kong, which maintain pegged exchange rate regime, and then their effect is more likely, more manifest in real estate, inflation. So this chart actually shows the trade-off between for 2008 to 2012. This chart shows the currency appreciation versus real estate increase. Okay, and probably we can have more time to discuss about the impact of loose monetary policy later. So inflation remains at this moment is quite below 4%. But we believe that this chart is a little bit distorting the figure because China and the large economies has a larger weight. So in terms of weight, the average is around 4%. But many South Asian economies has an inflation rate well above 7%. There are several countries which has a two-digit inflation too. So depending on the countries, inflation pressure is already building up, and this continued loose monetary policy with much reduced tail events, I think that the capital inflow will come more to Asia, and then that will actually start to build up the inflation pressure, given especially that many Asian economies are operating near potential. So we believe that the Asian policymakers, it's time for them to a little bit watch about the inflation pressure at this moment. So we are basically recommend them watch out the inflation pressure building up, and be careful about the cross-border capital inflows, which may come more in the future because of the loose monetary policy of advanced economies. So maybe it's not a good time to use monetary policy or fiscal policy as a demand management tool, but we have to look at for example, fiscal policy has focused more on the fiscal policy for inclusive growth. Monetary policies have to be more careful about the inflation pressure building up rather than just using a demand management tool from the slow growth of last year. Okay, and as I mentioned, the political risk at this moment, I will skip this one. So these are the kind of big picture. So if I summarize, I think we are expecting advanced economies will continue to have 1 to 2% growth and slow down, and moderate growth rate. And and Asia has a little bit heterogeneous performance, but we are believing that around 6% growth rate will be the norm for the next few years in Asia. And that means that if Asia continue to maintain this relatively high growth rate, 6%, what is the implication? Asia is no longer a small area. Asia can be already, it has a many important role in global recovery, but also in a commodity market, Asia already become a heavyweight. And for example, China alone explain about 40% of the whole metal market in the world, 20-30% of agricultural crops, and 20% of the non-renewable energies. So together with the rising ASEAN economies and Asian economies, it has a great implication for the commodities and especially for energy market. So that's what in our SIM chapter, we look at what is the implication of this relative high growth on energy. Given the time limit, I'll just give you the main findings. So main message is that if Asia continue to grow this relative high speed, it will increase energy demand massively. But at this moment, Asia's energy supply is mostly, energy demand is mostly met by the, carbon or the fossil fuel, energies. So if you continue to do it, it has a large negative impact on the global warming and CO2 problem. So definitely we have to find a new solution. So that I want to show some statistics. For example, in terms of relative GDP, the developing Asia, excluding Japan, at this moment, 2010, developing Asia's GDP share is of the whole world is 28%. If Asia continue to grow this 6% above growth rate, by 2035, Asia will explain 44% of the whole world GDP. On the other hand, in 2010, Asia's energy demand explained only 34% of the whole world energy demand. And then by 2035, its energy demand will account for 51 to 56% of the whole world. So Asia will have to consume 56% of whole world energy consumption if this trend continues. But Asia's endowment is simply not enough to have this, demand increase. We have relatively more coal. So coal reserves is about 26% of the whole world reserve, but we have a very little natural gas reserve, which is only 16%. And then if you look at the oil, it's only 9%. If you include natural gas liquid, then the Asia share will increase 15%, but which is quite low, then to satisfy 6% of the whole world demand by 2035, which means Asia will import more energy. So our projection says that the Asia's oil import will triple by 2035. Our dependence on Middle East will increase enormously. And then energy mix is a problem. If we continue to use the current mix of energy supply with some natural assumption of the technology progress, our forecasts say that coal use will increase by 81%, oil consumption will double, natural gas consumption will triple. That means that the more CO2 emissions. And then Asia alone, Asian CO2 emission alone will swamp global limit, which many environmental experts believe to be the maximum amount to contain the global temperature increase by less than 2 Celsius degree by 2035. So that total amount, the maximum amount was 22 billion tons by 2035. But according to our projection, Asia alone will emit 20 billion tons, which means that Asia alone can reach that limit. And also Asia's another problem is, the affordability. Among the people who has no access to electricity, Asia accounts for 50% of the world poor. These poor people. And then 79% of the whole world population, which depends on traditional fuels, which is CO2-based carbon and wood. Asia accounts for 79%. And how to provide, energy to them, the poor people, is a question. But problem is that we have to admit it's a really difficult problem to solve. Providing more energy to the poor people means that it should be cheaper energy, which means that it's a coal-based, which means CO2 emissions. It's a very difficult problem. In order to have inclusive growth, we have to provide them a better and the energy supply. But on the other hand, in order to be affordable, it should be cheap, which means coal, which means CO2 emission. So it's quite structurally very difficult questions. So what we are saying is that many solutions has to be tried simultaneously. The most important one is, first one, we cannot just allow the demand increase, without, checking the increase. So we really believe that curbing demand increase is quite essential, especially removing the fossil fuel subsidies is very important because fossil fuel subsidies now giving incentive for the overconsumption. More than that, many of these subsidies are going to the relatively, middle-income class or the high-income class rather than the poor-income classes. It's well known that most of the benefit of these fossil fuel subsidies go to, only less than 10% goes to the poor people. So really how to get rid of these fossil fuel subsidies, making them more targeted subsidy to poor people seems to be a very important agenda. And then we really have to develop renewable energies like the solar and wind. And there's a quite promising effort in Asia now. Unlike 10 years ago, now many Asian countries are producing solar and wind electricity. So significant progress. And many Asian countries are now world leader in manufacturing of solar power equipment. But on the other hand, and also hydro was important source. Biofuels become a new technology which does not necessarily compete with food is coming up, so we have high expectation. Given the time limit, let me just skip many things. But still, it's true that renewable energy still the price is higher than the traditional energy source. So unless this is except a few cases of the regional supply, it will be very hard to assume that this renewable will be the major source of energy in the near future, which means that given the urgency of environmental problem, at the same time we have to develop these new technologies, but at the same time how to clean the traditional energy source is a very important task too. So shale gas is kind of mentioned as alternatives here, and then in Canada, the shale gas is quite a big things at this moment. But Asia has, I didn't know it, but in our study we find that Asia has also potential. I didn't know that, but it looks like China has the largest shale gas endowment at this moment. The problem is that unlike the U.S. and Canada, shale gas of the Canada is mostly located very under the very populated area. So maybe extracting them may not be that easy as in like here. But anyway, it has a good potentials. Nuclear power is a hot potato. So after the Fukushima, everyone was very careful about nuclear. So we all know that the safety issues and proliferation issues. So it's very, it's a very important issue. But on the other hand, if we phase out the nuclear completely, our study shows that phasing out nuclear and using the conventional, energy mix will increase CO2 emission by 8 to 13%. So how to, compromise this trade-off seems to be a very important issue at this moment. And then regional integration seems to be very important. In a nutshell, in Europe, this energy market integration and sharing the common electricity and gas grid, save lots of money and CO2 emissions. So, but Asia, in somehow, because of many political difficulties in reaching agreement, energy market in Asia is not well, integrated. And we see many potential to improve our energy efficiency by integrating our market. So what is our most important policy implication from our study? We are saying that this is time for Asian policymakers to think big. So we are recommending them to establish a pan-Asian energy market by 2030 to the level of the European market integration. If Europe did it a long time ago, why Asians cannot? So we are suggesting Asian policymakers to set up some task force team, ministerial level task force team, to study European cases and how to integrate our markets. And we believe we cannot say that the solar is better or whether wind is better, what energy source is better, but there's lots of uncertainties, but we believe every watt counts. So, Asian government has to really work harder to develop new technologies as well as to make traditional technology much cleaner, like new coal technology kind of things. So R&D is a key. And then also at the same time, supporting energy affordability is a very important issue for the many poor Asian people. But saying these things is easier, but it's quite a dilemma, how to provide more cheaper energy to them so that they can afford these things can sometimes go against the CO2 emissions. So we believe that how to target our support for the poor people becomes much more important. So that is basically a major conclusion of our report. Anyway, so if I conclude, then we believe that the developing Asia is picking up. And then now looks like, I hope, and we believe that the European situation will muddle through and many tail events are subdued. Then Asia can maintain a 6% or higher growth rate in the future. And then also, together with China and India, there are many other Asian economies is becoming growing faster and providing a new dynamism in Asia. And that is why we are worrying about the inflation pressure in the near future. At the same time, we have to really focus more on structural issues such as how to secure, energy and how to make a more clean energy. So Asians' growth cannot be just the Asian growth. How to secure clean Asian growth seems to be a very important issue for us. Clean and inclusive growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I was particularly struck by the discussion of the trade-off, which I hadn't seen quite in that way before, between inclusive growth, meaning growth that supports the poor as well as the rich, and carbon emissions, and the difficulty of providing adequate energy that is relatively clean to the less well-off in the population. I think that's that's a very interesting discussion, and one that obviously will apply throughout the developing world, not just in Asia. Well, with that, let me ask Andrew about his reactions, his comments, his views.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Rory. Thank you, Dr. Reef, for a great report on the one hand and an excellent presentation on the other. It's a bit of a daunting task to comment in, I think you allotted me 10 minutes for comments on a report that's 318 pages, covers 40 or 50 countries in at least 4 or 5 very distinct regions. So you'll forgive me if I cherry pick my issues and my points a little bit. I think it's important initially just to acknowledge that on the main issues and the main storylines that are coming out in the report, we're in broad agreement. In terms of the forecast, we have very similar trends. We see weakness in the high-income countries continuing. We see the same sort of risk and agree that the sort of amplitude and likelihood of some of those risks that we've talked about in the United States, in the Euro area, that they've all diminished. So very much on the same wavelength there. If I had to nitpick, I would say that we're probably a little less optimistic in terms of the numbers when we get into the numbers for the East Asian and South Asia regions, but I really do think that's is a bit of a nitpicking issue. We're a little bit lower, but that's not really ultimately the storyline. What I find, and I have a lot of sympathy for this, I find difficult in any of these presentations, and you know, I work at the World Bank, so I talk about all developing countries all the time, and of course it makes no sense to talk about the developing countries are doing this or that, and it's a little bit true also for saying Asian economies are doing this and they're doing that. There's a lot of diversity there, and inevitably in this kind of presentation that gets lost a little bit. So I thought that it might be useful just to explore a little bit further that and give and these are elements that are in the report there, but perhaps didn't come out as clearly in the presentation or even in the summary as they might. And I thought there we could speak in terms of some of the challenges for the region right now. I wrote down I put 3 down numbers, and I think have 5 points, so you'll excuse me if I give different numbers and different actual numbers points. But the one was the weakness of growth in India, and you mentioned that, and that being an issue going forward. I think it's an issue at several levels. One is just the fact that growth, which had been growing quite strongly, 8%, coming down into the 5% range, your forecast having it come up to about 6%. That's much weaker than it was. It's good growth rates, but I think part of the real challenge facing India and facing a lot of countries in the region is what is the policy stance and what is the appropriate policy reaction to these developments. So we've gone in the developing world, and there I go, throwing all developing countries together, through a period in the pre-crisis area where growth was about 8% of GDP, as high as that, to now a period in the post-crisis period where growth is 5.5%, maybe 6% for developing Asia as well as for the rest of the world. And that poses real problems for policymakers. They have a population who has come to assimilate those very strong growth rates as the growth rates that they should legitimately aspire to. They have gone through a period where the popular press has talked incessantly about demand stimulus policies, and where arguably developing countries have relied very much on demand stimulus policies, when perhaps the problem is much more on the supply side, much more on the structural policies, and those are the explanations for the weakness of growth. So that's an issue, I think, for India. It's an issue of adjusting expectations on the policy side, but also in terms of the population, because if the population doesn't buy it, then you're not going to be able to do those reforms. And it's also probably an issue in the ASEAN countries as well. So we've got very strong growth, what I consider to be very strong growth in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Thailand. And yet there is, if you sort of follow the press, a sense that that growth is not really strong enough. And so we have a stance of policy, and you mentioned that is relatively relaxed, and even being relaxed further, notwithstanding that inflationary pressures are building and issues of the otherwise. So I would like to sort of explore those kinds of issues a little bit more. The other challenge that's there, and it's part and parcel of this whole story, is the story of China. So we had the news that Chinese growth came down to 7.7% in the first quarter. I think that the messaging that the Chinese put around that was exactly right. We have to get used to slower growth. This is not a problem. This is not something to be worried about. This is the new normal. But it hides a little bit the problem that the Chinese face in terms of moving away from an investment-led growth pattern towards a more balanced growth pattern. Currently, investment represents about 45% of GDP in China. Okay, for the preceding 30 years, when China was growing at 10% per year, investment was about 30% of GDP. And what's happened over the last 10 years is that investment to GDP ratio has been ratcheted up, partly because of lower interest rates initially, but also partly as a function of their response to the financial crisis, which used essentially investment mechanisms to keep growth growing at very strong rates. And we've got into this situation in China where that investment has to come down because it's not sustainable at that level. Either it's going to result in a lot of bad loans and a banking sector crisis like we've seen elsewhere, or it's going to result in a lot of unmet demand and other macroeconomic tensions that are going to be difficult to deal with. But how do you bring it down by 10 percentage points of GDP in a way that's safe and secure going forward? A very difficult challenge, which every time I won't say every time the economy slows down, but it's complicated by the fact that when the economy does slow down, there's a tendency to lose confidence and lose faith and to respond with stimulus yet again. And that stimulus comes to the form in investment, and you almost have this addiction to investment in China. And sometimes we in the West are fixated on this story of the early 2000s of China being an export-led growth story. I think really the issue now is it's an investment-led growth strategy. They are a little addicted to it, and moving away from that is a real risk for the region and for the global economy. So I probably used up my 10 minutes already. So
you can make one more point.
I can make one more point. All right, I will look through my list and see what I think is. I want to talk a little bit about commodities, so it'll be a long one point. I think there's a couple issues there that, again, sort of come in this problem of aggregating and lumping countries together. If we look at demand for commodities in the Asia region, the only really big outlier is China and China's demand for metals and minerals. Otherwise, the region looks similar to other developing countries. And at that level, it's not so much of a problem once we extrapolate from the metals and minerals story. The element of the report that I quite liked and caught my eye, and which I didn't hear in the presentation so much, was the story of subsidization and the fiscal cost of subsidization of energy and how moving away from that is going to form part of the solution. So I just really wanted to highlight that. Certainly the research at the World Bank is fairly clear that subsidization is an ineffective way of targeting assistance towards the poor, and I think you had a graph there showing that only a small percentage of that subsidies actually got to the poor, so it's not well targeted. But secondly, by keeping the prices low for the whole population, you keep the consumption of these products much higher than they would be if you're allowing market prices to operate. So I think that's just a point. It's in the report. Just a point that I think that's worth bringing to the fore even further. Anyway, I'll stop there, Uri, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I was particularly struck by your point that we may be witnessing a structural deceleration of growth in Asia, but the expectations of growth remain very high, and that induces governments to maybe use demand policies in a way that is inappropriate instead of focusing on structural policies. And when I heard you say that, I thought that I could probably say that about most countries, including the United States. It's my way of saying it's a very important point. You could say it about the United States. You could say it about a lot of the peripheral economies in Europe and the discussions going on there today, that we need more attention to these structural reforms. So with that, what I wanted to do is open it up and encourage you, and we've left quite a bit of time, encourage you to make your comments, raise questions, etc. At the beginning, I'll try and group 2 or 3 together just to encourage you to speak up. Please introduce yourselves. Yes, the lady at the front first. Yeah, I'll come to you there. Yeah. Yeah, there's a microphone coming.
Hi, I'm Kim Fan from the International Law Institute, and you emphasized a lot about developing new energy sources, but also a realization that a lot of it is based on fossil fuels right now. So we know that the oil is really in the Middle East and in Africa, and we know that China is having a lot of bilateral discussions and investment loans in Africa to secure those resources. Taiwan is also getting in that game. What would you recommend for the rest of the Asian countries to try to secure those resources? Should they try to engage in the type of bilateral discussions that China is?
There was a question at the very back. The lady there, and then Marivon after that, yeah. Is it the gentleman there at the back? Sorry, I can't see very well.
Thank you, Mr. Dadish. Thanks to Amber and her crew for putting today's event together. I have 2 questions. The first, if Dr. Rhee could consider it, just give us a flavor, your sense of the prohibitive costs of Western firms, or firms in general, investing specifically in China. There was an upper fold A1 piece in last weekend's Wall Street Journal that looked at a number of countries that are beginning to have second thoughts about keeping their personnel in an area that's pretty consistently adverse in its environmental costs to the workers there. The second question is, could any among the 3 of you give a sense of military concerns among the ASEAN states in the meeting in Brunei, I guess a couple of weeks ago, regarding peninsular conflict? Thanks.
Your affiliation, please.
I'm a student here in the city studying IR.
All right, okay. And Marivon, yes. You had a question?
Yes, Marivon Plessis-Fressard, MPF Consult, former World Bank. I know that I come from an infrastructure background, so to me it appears that in commodity, water supply should be really included as a major element and related intricately with energy. And I was wondering whether, I'm sorry I have not read the Outlook, but whether that was a concern, because I have understood that there are areas in Asia with very great densification of activities, agricultural activities and others, and I am not sure the water supply is all there, and that may be as important a constraint sometimes, or it could be, as energy itself. So I was wondering, the word water never came, and perhaps there is something to it to be said.
Maybe we'll take one more question and then we'll come back to the panel. The gentleman there? Yep, right there.
James Sang, IBM retired. Your projections for energy go to 2030, and by that time, countries like India and China could be either gone through or stuck in middle income traps. How do your scenarios distinguish between whether growth continues and they go through the middle income trap, or whether they get stuck in the middle income trap? What would the energy requirements or needs of those countries, how would they change?
Thanks very much for the really diverse questions. But I mean, if I move back questions, our assumption is yes, there is some chance of the middle income trap for those countries. But now 2035 is only 20 years later, and then we are assuming that their growth rate slow down. But the China and India will grow with I think I don't remember right away, but we are assuming China's growth rate will slowing down from 8 to 6% range, and India's growth rate will slow down from 6 to around 6 to 5% growth range. So, which means that we are basically assume they are not get stuck into the middle income trap. But we cannot assume our member countries will get stuck in the middle income trap and then forecast these numbers. But that does not necessarily mean that whether they will overcome this middle income trap is preordained or not. But our forecast naturally assume the slowdown of their growth, but they will continue to grow. That is our basic assumption. As for the water questions, yes, I think it's very important to have the water, food, energy relationships. It's a very important issue. ADB is doing lots of projects and study on this water, food, energy synergies. But unfortunately, our report focus only on energy. Because, if we want to really have a focused discussion. And actually, we are thinking about having a water as our new theme for the coming, not immediate future, but I think if possible, we would like to discuss water issues separately. And for the military concerns and geographic, the border dispute in Asia at this moment, I think it's a sensitive issue. And that's why we are raising it as one of the risk, and we say it's a political risk. So we really hope that now Asia has many new leaders this year, and we hope that they make these things wouldn't disturb the Asians' economic integration, which basically Asians' economic integration and our more tight value chain among us was the main driver of the Asians' growth and Asians' miracle in some sense. And it will be very unfortunate if we see that this border dispute really, block the future progress of the regional integration, which we have a high expectation. So we really hope that it can have good solutions. And for the Chinese effort of securing the resources, I think it's quite understandable, right? Because now they're growing fast and they need to secure the more energies. But on the other hand, that's only one solution. That is basically securing the energy supply, from the existing supply, and also they then make energy security much dependent on many other political reasons, right? So that won't solve this problem. So real solution now must be some new technology, and this is why the many Asian economies looking at this energy issue from an industrial diversification issue and also industrial policy issue. So rather than, you have lots of uncertainties. You probably have heard about the Suntech story. The solar, the equipment company was bankrupt. There's lots of criticism by Western media that this is the solar technology in China was subsidized. And this is, there's many criticism on these things. But on the other hand, I'm not saying this from my personal perspective, but when I meet the Asian leaders, they believe this is a kind of inevitable process, because we need more energy. Because to speak frankly, many Asian policymakers believe that if you look at the per capita energy consumption, we are much lower. So in some sense, if you talk about CO2 emission and many environmental problems, but our reporters are not saying that we are only responsible, because if you just look at the per capita energy consumption, per capita CO2 emissions, advanced economy is much higher. But we are now catching up. But simply because we have more people. If everyone becomes richer, is it going to contaminate the earth more? So does it mean that we shouldn't be rich? That's not, you cannot say that way, right? So in some sense, this is a kind of dilemma. So how to develop the new technology is very important. We know that finger pointing each other who are responsible for this is not productive. On the other hand, since we want to be richer, we have to find a new clean technology. That's an issue. And then many Asian policymakers are interested in this issue because if we develop a new clean technology, that will actually make us leapfrog some of the advanced economies, and we can actually contribute to the clean growth as well as to be a bit richer. So I think securing some traditional energy source is one thing, but on the other hand, how to develop new technology seems to be a more fundamental question. There are lots of uncertainties, but somehow we have to do this. So that's a kind of our tone of report. And in the same sense, I think Andrew mentioned the subsidization issue is very important. We agree. That's why we emphasize very much. But we do not want to say constrained demand growth is the only solution. That means this is quite unfair to us. Constraining demand increase is one solution that we have to contribute. At the same time, we have to do many things to develop a new technology and many other, securing the new energy source. These kind of things are very important to maintain our growth perspective.
Andrew, did you want to pick any of that up? I mean, I'm especially interested if you have any views. You can talk about anything. If you have any views on the middle income trap, is there, as you see the whole of the developing world, is there such a thing as a middle income trap? Or is this a middle income mirage that is out there?
That's an easy question. I'll make an effort to address that. That's not an easy question. But what I wanted to say, and I think it's similar to what Dr. Rio was just saying, was that a lot of this is, as an economist, is about letting the prices work. And some of the problems that we observe, in particular about water resources and the allocation of water resources, but also about energy resources, is because we aren't allowing those prices to work, and so we are having these heavy subsidizations, and we're seeing important distortions, which have very large fiscal costs in very many of our client countries, and that ends up constraining them from doing things that might be more effective and might be more useful. So I'm a little more clearly of the view that trying to draw away from this subsidization strategy would be for the better for most of our clients, and ultimately is going to be part of the solution also for water eventually. I know in high-income countries, the distortions that are put in place by the subsidization of what might otherwise be judged inappropriate uses of water are enormous, and of course that means that the pressures to maintain them are also enormous because there's a lot of money being made from the status quo. So these are difficult questions. On the middle income trap, I think the data is really, really, really murky. There's any number of examples of countries that you could say that they got caught in a middle income trap, and they're usually easy to identify because they have stayed in middle income status for a long time. And then we forget about all these other high income countries that, I guess they must have been middle income countries at some stage, but now they're high income countries, and so we don't include them in the group. And obviously South Korea is a shining example of a country that forgot to get the memo that there was a middle income trap and soared right through it. Japan would be another example in the region, and arguably I think China's on the road to being yet another. So the issue really is less about the inevitability of the middle income trap and more about what are the factors that generate it and help it to occur. And my own private view, and I'm not sure that there's a real strong sort of economic literature to back that up, but a big component of it is the inequality, or it boils down to inequalities and various inequalities. So inequality of access to education. So if you are not actually spreading the capacity to participate in the growth and to benefit from the growth throughout the population, then that will and can and does generate a middle income fact. Inequality in terms of the distribution of wealth can be a factor in there. And so I think where we do observe this phenomena most clearly are in societies which and then the causality here gets very difficult, right? But they tend to be, in the final analysis, economies that are relatively unequal for a variety of different reasons.
Good. Well, I always like to provoke people by saying that, what about the high income trap? What about what's happening in Japan, in Europe, in the United States? Is that a trap? But that's an issue for another day. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent will continuing improvement in energy efficiency change the picture?
Okay, maybe we'll take one more and then, yes, the gentleman at the back there.
Hi, my name is Kim Singh. I'm from Voice of America. I'm a reporter. Just to Dr. Rhee, what kind of recommendation will you give to a country in kind of Southeast Asia concerning the energy hunt, which definitely will come from China? Because countries like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, are already in trouble arguing over the Mekong Dam that have been built or are planning to build more that will affect a lot of livelihood along the Mekong itself. And that's all. Thank you. Yes, and do you expect more problem with all this growth by 2035?
Go ahead.
About the energy efficiency, our estimate actually incorporate in some sense. When I say that by 2035, we are forecasting between 51% of the whole world consumption to 56%. And there the assumption is that we are changing how fast this energy efficiency will improve. And our methodology is basically looking at how the energy efficiency improve as your income grow. So basically, our assumption is based on the past experience of advanced economies, how you save your energies along the road of your development. So in that sense, our estimate incorporate your concern. But our estimate cannot include some assumption that new technology developed and now people's recognition about the importance of environment really changes. So energy efficiency if energy efficiency will increase much more faster than previously, then probably our estimate may be a little bit overestimation. But still, in some sense, in partly it's reflected. As for the kind of what you're describing between China and Southeast Asian, Cambodia and Laos, this is all related with how to secure energies, especially water. River goes through the whole China and others. So in some sense, that's why we are emphasizing regional integration and regional policy cooperation is much more important. And actually two sense. One is that if you have a more integrated market, then each country can do the division of labor. Countries which has more water resources may focus more on the water energies. On the other hand, countries which has a comparative advantage in solar, they can focus more on solar and they exchange each other. So that may really reduce their dependence on coal and, every country does not need to have every energies, right? On the second sense is that this policy coordination will definitely lessen the political, conflict with each other. So, but if we don't, have this kind of regional integration and cooperation, then the issue that you raised will be a very critical issue in the future because, people are looking for the more energy. And then I think you will probably, politically you want to secure your own edges, which has a negative spillover to others. So that can be a reality.
Yes.
Maudud Khan, USRA. I have two questions. So the energy numbers that you're getting for 2035, they're probably based on some kind of energy demand modeling that suggests different sectors. Yeah. And so so there's one part of new energy technologies for generation, but then there are other innovative things that you can do in these separate sectors that reduce the energy demand. Is that somehow accounted for? And the second question is, if climate models are to be, are to be believed, the frequency and intensity of severe weather events would increase. And
can you repeat the second question? I'm sorry.
So, if climate model projections are to be believed, you will see an increase in the severe weather events, increased intensity and frequency of these events. Mm-hmm. Do those impact the GDP in a negative way overall, and are your projections account for that somehow? Thank you.
For the second question, actually, it was not, because we are not talking about climate change's impact on GDP. We have many other reports. What will be the climate change's impact on the regional growth and other things, but that does not necessarily mean that because basically we are assuming that the GDP growth rate of Asia will continue to 6% and on. So in some sense, we are taking the GDP growth rate as exogenous. And so I think definitely is not incorporated. And the impact of climate change on growth rate we have many other reports. As for your question, how we estimate this demand increase, definitely we look at the sectors, transportation or, housing, or we look at the sector level. And like as my answer to the gentleman over here, we basically incorporate some kind of improvement of each sector by using historical data. So if you really think that the new technology is developed and this, the efficiency will really increase and demand changes, but that will really change the picture. But on the other hand, I think as many of the things that you describe is more like a supply factor rather than the actually factor which will affect the demand. So in some sense, our result is a first cut, but it's it's okay estimate.
Andrew, do you want to add to this or the previous question?
Yeah. I think just on the energy story in general, sometimes, and this might be one of those times, we have a tendency to do linear projections of things, and we say oil prices have been rising, oil prices will rise forever, oil is or has been in short supply, oil will be in short supply forever. What is pretty clear, though, is that we've unleashed some fairly powerful economic forces over the last 10 or 15 years. Oil prices are 4 to 5 times higher than they were in 2000, and that's generating really, really, really big changes that we're starting to see the effect of, and they generate changes both on the demand side and on the supply side. So this whole fracking story and all of the new energies being found in the United States, those technologies existed 20 years ago. They're being used now because they're profitable at these kinds of prices, and they generate the new supply. Similarly, the oil and the geological formations that contain it in Africa and elsewhere, they were there 20 or 30 years ago, but we weren't going out and exploring them and getting them because it wasn't worth it and there was no need to at that time. So when we sort of try and do these long-range, and Lord knows when you do a long-range forecast, you are in fairly difficult territory. But one of the striking things is the effect of the prices, both on the supply and the demand. On the demand side, OECD, so all the high-income countries, demand for oil has fallen by 10% since 2007, basically because of the price. We've seen a slowing in the rate of growth of demand for oil in the developing countries, so that now it's growing at sort of less 1%, 1.5%, because of these high prices. I moved to the United States in 2004. At that time, the road was full of Humvees and other vehicles of great consumption. There are none now, as you will notice, and there are all sorts of Priuses and other things. And the Prius has twice the energy efficiency in consumption, not on production, and energy of a what's the equivalent of a Prius without the hybrid? It's a Corolla, I think is basically the same car. So you're looking at a technology that is there, that is double the efficiency, that is at some level of production going to be a totally dominant feature. And as that technology spreads and becomes more banal, as it is increasingly is, to the developing world, then it's going to change the dynamics enormously there as well. So I think that in all of our projections, we probably underestimate that the importance of those kinds of changes, which are endogenous. My real concern is that oil prices could fall a lot, and as a result, that technological improvement won't occur, and we will be dealing with the carbon effects. And I think that Dr. Rhee and his colleagues were exactly right to focus on the carbon side of the story, because that's really where the major concerns are. That's where the long-run difficulties are.
Yes, please.
Actually, I think this is the right point. I really appreciate Andrew's explanation. What we did is we are not saying that our picture will happen in 2035. You know, as I mentioned, we are saying that what happens if the Asia continue to grow 6%? If in between, if the price goes up and the Asia cannot use all the energies, if they have to force to use less energies, which means the growth rate will slow down. So what we are saying is, hypothetically, if Asia continue to grow 6%, and if they have to use the current mix of energy supply with some past history of the development trend, then this will what happen. So that's not what we want to. So let's change our behaviors and let's develop new technologies, and those things will change the real picture. So I think what we are saying is that we are not focusing what will happen in 2035. We are saying there's a hypothetical assumption that if Asia continue to grow with this energy mix, this is a very gloomy picture, so we have to do something else. That's the point.
Okay, let me, just take my prerogative as moderator for a second and ask now is the time for a simple question. The new Japanese policies of greatly expanding the money supply at a fantastic rate. Dr. Rhee, have they gone mad in Tokyo? Or do you think that this is a wise course of action? And Andrew, I'd also like to hear your view. Yeah.
Actually, I think this is for us, it's a very sensitive issue because our former president of ADB, Mr. Kuroda, is now in Central Bank of Japan. So I really respect my former boss, and so I think I have to be very careful. But I think Japan's monetary policy, in some sense, like a QE of the United States, Japan has many reasons to rely on expansionary monetary policy to boost their economy, because Japan has been in recession quite a long time. So I think they have many reasons, like the U.S. and Europe, that they have to rely on monetary policy. But on the other hand, I think whether monetary policy alone will boost Japan's real economy activities, we can have many different views. And Mr. Kuroda-san also make it clear that the monetary policy will buy him a time. But the other two pillars of Abenomics, which is fiscal consolidation in the long run and fiscal flexibility in the short term, and then also structural reform, which make Japan more competitive. TPPs, that is one thing he mentioned. And those kind of, the other two pillars must be a very important element of all these packages. Media just focus on the expansion monetary policy, but that seems to be a little bit necessary but not sufficient. So for Japan's recovery. But that's for the impact on Japan. On the other hand, I think there are many issues that are now being discussed is what a little bit is a spillover effect of Japan's monetary policy for other Asia and other regions. That is a more sensitive issue. And we have some analysis in our report about the impact of QE on Asia, so we can use that one. But I think the situation is quite different. When U.S. used QE, it was in the middle of the crisis. So the uncertainty is quite high. Investors are quite risk averse. So even though central bank print out the money, the investors are not willing to invest in emerging market, which they believe is also risky. So risk aptitude was not that high, and but still, it helps to rebound the capital inflow to the region, but actually didn't increase the capital inflow much higher than the prior to the crisis. But on the other hand, I think from now on, when the uncertain tail event is quite risk of tail events reduced, if U.S. and Europe, together with Japan, or advanced economies continue to do the loose monetary policy, I think the situation can be different. More investors can be more can have a more higher risk aptitude, looking for a higher yield, which means that the money can come to Asia, and I think it can have quite diverse impact. Economies with more Japanese companies operating, and economies which receive lots of foreign direct investment from Japan. I'm thinking about countries like Cambodia, Myanmar maybe, and Indonesia and some ASEAN economies. I think if Japan succeed in boosting their economy, they may actually benefit. Many Japanese companies, in anticipation of the weak Japanese yen, may move their money to the many ASEAN economies, so their economy will gain more. On the other hand, my country, Korea, which compete with Japan in an export market, and those countries will definitely negatively hurt by the weaker yen, and it really depends how much go down. So impact can be quite heterogeneous.
Andrew?
So I think I agree virtually with everything Dr. Rhee said. So I would add one thing that I think is perfectly legitimate for the Bank of Japan to say that they want to target inflation, that they want to bring disinflation or deflation to an end and pursue efforts to achieve that goal. I mean, that's what countries throughout the world do. And there's all sorts of benefits that could stem from that. So that's one point. The second one is, and I think Dr. Rhee was saying that in probably a more politic fashion than I'm going to, is that if we look at the history of Japan over the last 25 years, it's been a series of demand and monetary and fiscal stimulus measures which have been singularly unsuccessful in solving the difficulties that Japan has. And from that point of view, it's not clear that this is going to be much different unless, and that's where I agree entirely with Dr. Rhee, is unless that third pillar, which is the structural reform, really does have a significant component to it. And so that's really the question out there. Are the steps that need to be taken going to be taken? Finally, just in terms of the impact on the world economy, which is sort of foremost in our minds, I agree also there that it's not that clear. Partly because we're going into a period where if the U.S. isn't tightening, it certainly will be stabilizing its quantitative easing. So there's going to be a sort of shift in terms of where the flows are going into the global economy. There's a second issue of whether the degree of leakages of the money from the Japanese economy will be equivalent to the U.S. The Japanese economy is a little more insular, stronger home bias in terms of investment activities of individuals in the Japanese economy. So that's likely to prevent having this wall of capital that people have talked about elsewhere in the world as being an issue. And then third, I agree entirely that for the developing countries, the fact that they're not direct competitors with Japan means that the impact for them of the depreciation of the yen is much more complicated, and they stand to benefit if it actually does help Japanese demand and Japanese activity to accelerate.
Very good. Just a word of caution for me, which is that historically what I have seen is that it's a lot easier to practice monetary expansion or indeed fiscal expansion than to carry out structural reforms. And many governments talk about structural reforms, but whether they actually do structural reforms is a lot tougher to discern. Certainly, that's been the situation in Europe, and I would argue in the United States for many years now. Yes, the lady at the back.
This lady here also had a question.
Which one?
This one here, the check shirt sweater.
This one here? Okay, yeah. Okay, we'll come to you.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I follow the point you just made about the fiscal capabilities and structural reform. And I like to focus on Vietnam because Vietnam is now working on its TPP with the U.S. And if Vietnam and U.S. are successful with the TPP coming in between the two countries, then that would be a good signal for people in the Southeast Asia. And so I would ask Dr. Rhee, with your expertise, your knowledge, and from your position at the ADP Bank, what is your assessment about current Vietnam's fiscal capabilities and potential of successful structural reform to come into the TPP successfully? Thank you.
The lady here had a question here in front.
I'm Sharon Shin, a PhD student at Stanford. I have two questions for Dr. Rhee. The first one is that you wrote, like in your policy recommendations, the first one is the establishment of a pan-Asian energy market by 2030. What do you see as the obstacles or feasibility about like such establishment? And my second question concerns the recent signing of the U.S.-China joint statement on climate change, which is pretty much a breakthrough because the two countries did sign a lot of MOUs like in the past, but never a joint statement. And what do you see as the opportunities coming out of this statement, especially do you see this as a sign that China can actually accelerate its deployment of renewable energy and like reduce its reliance on, say, coal consumption? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll stop there with the questions and let our panel answer the questions and then give us any concluding remarks. Before you do, I would really myself appreciate if you talked a little bit more broadly about the TPP. Vietnam is very interesting, but the broader, do you see TPP as being a real opportunity, a big thing, or is it secondary in these projections? Andrew, too, if you have a view. Yeah.
As for the structural reform for Vietnam, I think the issue of Vietnam at this moment is Vietnam had a very high growth path if you look at the last decades. But around the global financial crisis, Vietnam has a structural problem of the lots of NPL, non-performing loans, especially in banking sector. And somehow they lose their growth momentum. It's still high, it's 5% growth rate. It's not a bad thing, but if you compare with 10%, 9% growth rate a few years ago. So the question that people are asking is whether Vietnam can back to the high growth path, given their income level is only at this moment $1,000. So they have a long way to go. As for the middle income trap, we make a joke that there are many, actually here in Washington, when I say Asia, it's more like China and India, but actually there are many other Asian economies. So in order to avoid the middle income trap, they have to be first a middle income country first. So there are many countries like they have to be a middle income country first. And Vietnam is a good example. And so I think there are two questions. TPP is very important, but I think more important is how to get rid of these NPLs. Banking sector reform is most urgent. And the second question, if they succeed in the banking sector reform, are they going to move back to their trend growth rate again? But there are some people who are saying that it may be not easy because now Myanmar is coming up. Many other Asian economies within even Asia can compete with the low wage of Vietnam before. So whether Vietnam can actually attract more capital, considering the rising many other stars in Asia. So it's be more competitive. So we have to really look at that. That's, I think they need a structural reform plus alpha, so to make it get back to. So these are the issues. And as for the question about the pan-Asian energy market, the political difficulties, it's easy to say for me to have a pan-Asian energy market, but what it means is that you have to have harmonized your regulation. you have to have a very transparency, all the energy information, how much demand you have, how much supply you will do it. And many policymakers and many governments think this is a kind of national security issue. So it's very hard to exchange the energy, information, how much reserves you have, what kind of things. So lots of political difficulties. And it really depends on the mutual confidence and mutual trust of the countries. So you are asking questions whether Europeans have more mutual trust each other, whether the Asians can have as equivalent mutual trust each other. So depending on that one, I think this is a more political issue. And I'm not a climate change specialist, so probably, I haven't read about China-US recent agreement, so probably it's for me safe not to comment on this one. I will start that one. And as for the TPP as a whole, let me just mention that TPP in Asia is now regarded not only an economic, issue, but also a political issue. So it has many different dimensions. So very hard to say in one word. Thank you.
Andrew, concluding remarks, answers to questions. Anything you want to say?
At the risk of repeating myself, I think it's mainly structural, and that's basically my sort of mantra for the last year or so, is that we've gone through this financial crisis, which had enormous impacts throughout the global economy, really brought demand management issues to the fore, and has distracted our attention, I think, often away from the source of the acceleration in developing country growth over the last 15, 20 years, which was structural reform. It was getting our macroeconomic policies right. It was getting regulatory conditions right. It was increasing education. It was increasing health care. It was building social safety nets. And if we want to have that kind of strong growth, so the 6% assumption for Asia over the next 20 years is going to be there, then we're going to have to keep that momentum there of constantly improving it. So the TPP for me forms part of that, but it's only a small part of it, and it's certainly not a panacea. That is really where the focus has to rely. And the trick is, as you mentioned, Uri, many people say structural reform. It's a lot harder to make it happen, and it's politically often very, very difficult and painful.
Well, we have an institution called the IMF, which, as you know, stands for it's mainly fiscal. We need a new institution which is called the IMS, which is it's mainly structural. And then we're going to get a lot more attention to these issues. I'd like to thank Dr. Lee and Andrew Burns for, I think, a very instructive panel discussion and overview of the issues. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.